Under a sky of iron and rain, a carriage climbs towards Strathden, a fortress of stone, a house of echoes. Constance Vale arrives a bride sold to a stranger, a duchess without a wedding night. No husband greets her, only a velvet-sealed letter. Follow the river, do not trust the factor. In that ink lies a secret about to surface, a past that refuses burial, and an impossible choice between duty and desire. Whispers coil through corridors, portraits watch, and the Highlands hold their breath. What truth waits beyond the moor? Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what do you love most about period romances, the passion, the scandals, or the hard-won grace? Inverness, Scotland, year of our Lord, 1861. The wind howled across the Highland road as if warning her to turn back. Through the rain-blurred glass of the carriage window, Constance Vale saw nothing but a vast, untamed land. Hills rolling into mist, heather bending under the storm, and a loneliness that seemed older than time itself. Her gloved fingers tightened around the frayed ribbon of her reticule. Inside, it lay the document that had sealed her fate, a marriage contract signed not by love, but by desperation. The name on the parchment still echoed in her mind, Alistair MacCraig, Duke of Strathden. A man she had never met, whose fortune had bought her freedom from ruin and her stepfather's gambling debts. She had been bartered like property, her virtue the coin of transaction. The thought burned her throat, yet she sat upright, the perfect image of composure. A governess could not afford tears, not even on the day of her wedding. The carriage jolted over the uneven road, splashing mud against the windows. Outside, the last light of day vanished behind the mountains, leaving only a dull glimmer over the moors. Somewhere beyond that horizon, she imagined a castle waiting, cold, vast, and silent, as the man she was to call husband. When at last the horses halted, Constance drew a breath that tasted of fear and rain. The door opened to reveal a man holding a lantern. He was not the Duke. "Welcome to Strathden Castle, Your Grace," he said, bowing with the stiffness of duty. His face was narrow, his eyes calculating. "I am Mr. Edwin Muir, the estate factor. His Grace regrets he could not meet you this evening." Constance stepped down, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She looked up at the castle that loomed before her, a fortress of stone upon the hill, its windows black against the sky, its turrets veiled by mist. No candlelight greeted her from within, no sound of a household awaiting its mistress, only the ceaseless cry of the wind through the pines. "His Grace regrets?" she repeated, her voice calm, though her heart trembled beneath her corset. "A matter of business, no doubt," Muir replied, offering his arm. "His letter will explain." He led her through the great oak doors into a hall so vast that her footsteps echoed like whispers from another century. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her from the walls, their painted eyes following her with silent judgment. A fire burned weakly in the hearth, its warmth barely reaching her chilled hands. "I have arranged for your belongings to be taken to the Duchess's chambers," Muir said, his tone smooth but distant. "You will find everything prepared." He bowed again, his expression unreadable, and withdrew into the shadows before she could ask another question. Constance stood alone. The silence of the castle seemed to thicken around her. She could hear the faint drip of rain from the eaves, the groan of old timbers, the flutter of her own uncertain breath. Fiona MacCrae, the housekeeper, appeared at the top of the stairs, a sturdy Highland woman with silver hair tucked under a linen cap. "Your Grace?" she said, her accent soft but firm. "Come, the fire's lit upstairs. The journey must have tired you." As Constance followed, she caught the scent of beeswax and damp stone. The corridor was long and dimly lit, hung with tapestries faded by age. In one, she glimpsed a battle scene, Highlanders in tartan facing soldiers in red. The threadbare embroidery seemed almost to move in the flickering lamplight. Her chamber was elegant but austere, a canopy bed draped in dark velvet, a marble fireplace glowing faintly, and heavy curtains drawn against the storm. A silver tray waited on the table, holding a single sealed envelope tied with a strip of black ribbon. Fiona placed her cloak on a chair and nodded toward the letter. "It came from His Grace," she said quietly. "Delivered by one of the riders before sunset." Constance stared at the envelope. Her pulse quickened. She reached out, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. The parchment inside was thick, the handwriting bold yet precise, each stroke deliberate, as if carved rather than written. "My wife," it began, "forgive my absence. What I must do cannot be delayed. The truth is not safe here, not yet. Follow the river if you seek answers. Do not trust the factor. Speak of this to no one." There was no signature, only the mark of a family crest, a stag and a blade, impressed into the wax. The fire snapped behind her. Constance felt the warmth of it against her back, but her blood ran cold. She read the words again, every syllable tightening the air around her. The factor, the river, the truth. Fiona cleared her throat gently. "Will your Grace take supper in the dining hall?" Constance folded the letter and slipped it into her reticule. "No," she said softly. "Not tonight." When Fiona left, the room fell into stillness. Constance stood by the window, parting the curtain just enough to glimpse the world beyond. The rain had ceased, and moonlight spilled across the hills. In the distance, the river shimmered like a silver thread winding through the dark valley. A loneliness unlike any she had ever known settled in her chest. She was a bride without a groom, a duchess in a house of strangers, bound to a name that might already belong to a ghost. Yet somewhere in that mist, the man who had written those words still breathed. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her reflection merging with the pale light outside. "Follow the river," she whispered. And as the wind rose again, carrying the scent of pine and rain, she made a silent vow, not of love, but of resolve. Whatever secrets Strathden Castle held, she would uncover them. For though she had been sold, her heart was not yet conquered. The morning light in the Highlands came softly, as though it too hesitated to enter the ancient halls of Strathden Castle. A pale grey mist crept through the tall windows, casting its veil upon tapestries long faded and stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Constance, now Duchess of a title that felt more like a shackle than a crown, awoke not to the warmth of a husband's presence, but to the groaning silence of old walls and unanswered questions. The fire in her chamber had long gone cold. She rose, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders before pulling back the heavy drapes. Below, the moorland stretched endlessly, wild and indifferent. Heather bowed in the morning wind. A single raven perched atop the North Tower's battlements, like a watchman of secrets too ancient to name. She had slept poorly. Her dreams were full of unfinished voices and half-open doors. The letter from the Duke still pulsed in her thoughts, like a bruise just beneath the skin. Follow the river. Do not trust the factor. Words that offered no comfort, only the chill of purpose. A knock at the door, light but firm. Fiona McCrae entered with a tray and the unmistakable air of a woman who had run a household longer than many had lived. She wore her black wool gown with dignity, the ring of keys at her waist announcing her presence with each step. "Your Grace," she said with a faint nod. "Tea and oatcakes. The kitchens are scarce this early, but I saw to it myself." Constance thanked her, her voice soft but steady. "You are kind, Mrs. McCrae. Fiona will do." Her tone allowed no argument. His Grace never cared much for titles inside the house, though I imagine things may change now. "Will they?" Constance asked, searching the woman's face. Fiona's gaze held hers for a breath too long. "Strathden always changes its mistress, not the other way around." Then she gestured to the tray. "Eat, Your Grace. You'll need strength for the halls." The words felt like more than mere advice. Later that morning, Constance took it upon herself to explore. No one had come to offer guidance, and she refused to be a ghost in her own home. The castle corridors sprawled like the ribs of some ancient creature, cold, echoing, alive in strange ways. She passed portraits of men with solemn brows and women whose beauty had long surrendered to dust. One painting caught her attention, a young woman in a pale green gown, her hand resting on a greyhound's head. The plaque below read, Isla Macraig, 1802. The likeness to the face Constance had glimpsed in the mirror that morning was uncanny. A chill swept her spine. Voices rose faintly from beyond a carved door. She paused, then pressed it open gently. The library. Shelves reached toward a ceiling, lost in shadows. The scent of aged parchment and pipe smoke lingered like a memory. Mr. Muir stood by the hearth, speaking with a young man whose face Constance could not see. Both stopped when she entered. "Your Grace," Muir said, recovering swiftly. "Forgive the intrusion. Estate matters require attention even in the quietest hours." Constance stepped forward with the grace of a woman raised among manners but not illusions. "Then I hope I am not a burden to the estate." Muir offered a tight smile. "A duchess is never a burden. Though I confess we were not expecting your arrival so soon." His Grace had indicated a later date. "He also indicated other things," she replied coolly. "But he is not here to explain them." The young man turned slightly, and she saw now it was one of the stable hands, no older than 16. His gaze was downcast, and he clutched his cap nervously. Muir dismissed him with a wave, and the boy scurried out. "Do you ride, Your Grace?" Muir asked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, though the hour barely touched noon. "I do," Constance said, "when the path is clear. A good instinct." He sipped, watching her over the rim of his glass. "The land here is not as tame as English fields. One must learn to listen to it." Constance returned his gaze without flinching. "And one must learn who to trust when listening." The silence that followed was sharp. After a polite retreat, she returned to her chambers to find something odd. Her writing desk drawer slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced, but disturbed. She had locked it herself the night before, though nothing appeared missing. She examined the brass keyhole. A faint scratch marred the surface. Someone had tried to open it and perhaps succeeded. She pressed her fingers against the wood, her heart a tight drum. The letter from the Duke was not inside. She had moved it, yes, but had she told anyone where? No. That evening, unable to sit still, she ventured into the village. A small escort followed at a distance, 2 older footmen who said little and stared even less. The path wound down the hill into a scattering of cottages, humble and dignified, their thatched roofs stooping under the weight of long winters. As she walked, conversation ceased. Children were pulled gently indoors. A woman hanging linens averted her eyes. Only one boy, perhaps 10, stood his ground beside the well. His hair was a wild halo of copper, his eyes the colour of storm clouds. "Are you the new lady?" he asked. "I suppose I am," she answered, lowering her voice to match his gravity. He held out a folded scrap of paper, dirty at the edges. "A man gave me this to give to you, said I'd know you by your eyes." Constance took the paper, her hands shaking despite the cold. She opened it. There it was again, the bold hand of the Duke, the same crest stamped in wax. "They know I'm close. Be careful whom you question. I will find you again. A. Dated 3 days earlier." She looked up. This man, what did he look like? But the boy had already vanished between 2 cottages. She returned to the castle as twilight turned the moors to smoke. That night, sleep evaded her. The corridors whispered. A shutter banged somewhere on the upper floor, and in the distance, from the window of her chamber, she saw movement among the trees, not an animal, not a shadow, but a figure, upright, still, watching. Her breath caught, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. And the castle swallowed its echoes once more. The morning broke under a low sky of pewter, the air trembling with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Across the valley, the river wound through the heather like a silver serpent, restless and secretive. From her chamber window, Constance Vale, Duchess of Strathden, watched it glitter between the hills. It seemed to whisper to her that river, its call quiet but insistent, as if the words from her husband's letter had come alive in its current. Follow the river. Her breath clouded the glass as she leaned closer. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of purpose. Somewhere beyond those waters, hidden beneath the Highland's solemn beauty, lay the truth about her husband, about the castle, about herself. She dressed without summoning help. Her hands were quick but deliberate as she tied the laces of her walking boots and wrapped a dark wool cloak around her shoulders. She tucked her gloves into her belt, placed the folded letter in her bodice, and, with her heart steadying to the rhythm of resolve, descended the staircase. The great hall was nearly empty. Only Fiona Macrae stood by the hearth, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill, a ledger open before her. The old housekeeper looked up sharply when she saw Constance. "Out so early, Your Grace?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "The air will clear my thoughts," Constance replied gently. "The river path intrigues me." Fiona hesitated. "Take care by the banks, my lady. The ground gives way where the soil's soft from the last storm, and—" Her gaze flicked toward the door, where a shadow moved briefly. "Not all who walk the moor this time of day are friendly to strangers." Constance nodded and offered a small smile. "I am no stranger to solitude." She stepped into the courtyard, where the wind swept through the arches with a low moan. The grey clouds drifted low, and the scent of pine and damp moss filled her lungs. The path wound down toward the valley, flanked by gnarled trees and a carpet of heather so thick it seemed to drink the sound of her footsteps. She walked until the castle disappeared behind the ridge. The river, when she reached it, was wider than she had imagined, its surface restless under the wind. The water murmured over stones polished smooth by time, and on its bank stood a cairn of ancient rocks, older than any building she had seen in her life. It rose from the earth like a sentinel. The letter's words returned to her. "Follow the river." Constance approached the cairn and ran her hand along its surface. The stones were slick with moss, but beneath the green she felt something rough, unnaturally carved. She crouched and brushed the earth away. There, half buried, was a small opening between two slabs. It was no accident of nature. Her pulse quickened. The opening was narrow, but deep enough for a person to pass. The air that drifted from within was cold and smelled faintly of iron and peat. She took one step forward, then another, until darkness swallowed her boots. "Your Grace." The voice came from behind her, low, rough, commanding. She turned so quickly she nearly lost her footing. A man stood a few paces away, his figure outlined against the grey light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat of coarse wool spattered with mud. A walking stick leaned against his shoulder. His hair was sun-bleached red and unkempt beneath his cap. His limp was pronounced, but his presence unyielding. "I might ask, what business brings a duchess to the river alone?" he said, his accent thick with Highland earth. "Who are you?" Constance asked, her chin lifting instinctively. "Ewan Fergus, gillie of these lands," he answered. "I tend to the game and the river, and on occasion to those who lose their way. I have not lost mine." He studied her for a moment, the faintest hint of a smirk shadowing his weathered face. "Forgive me, Your Grace, yet the moor can be deceiving. It draws folk toward what's buried best left alone." Constance's fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. "Do you guard the river, as well as the secrets that lie beside it?" His eyes darkened. "I guard what's worth keeping alive." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind picked up, stirring her cloak and the long strands of hair that had escaped her bonnet. Then, quietly, Ewan reached out and covered the opening with a broad, flat stone, sealing it once more beneath the moss. "You'd do well to leave this place, my lady," he said. "The river remembers, the cairn remembers, but those who dig too deep may not like what they find." "And yet," she murmured, "some truths must be unearthed if the living are to breathe." Ewan's gaze met hers then, steady, unreadable, not unkind. Then let the living be careful not to wake the dead. He offered his arm, not as a servant, but as a man who had seen too many storms. Reluctantly, she accepted, her fingers brushing the rough wool of his sleeve. It was a brief contact, no more than a second, yet something passed through it. A strange warmth, the kind that sparks not affection, but recognition. The walk back to the castle was silent. Rain began to fall, fine and persistent, softening the outlines of the hills. When they reached the courtyard, Constance turned to speak, but Ewan had already disappeared down the servants' path. Only the faint scrape of his walking stick against the stones lingered in the air. That night, the castle seemed even more desolate than usual. The wind pressed against the windows, whispering in tones she could almost mistake for voices. Constance sat by the hearth, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and stared into the flames. The letter's words echoed again, but now they intertwined with Ewan's warning. Do not trust the factor. The door creaked open softly. Fiona entered, carrying the same worn ledger Constance had seen that morning. I thought you might wish to look at this, the housekeeper said. It's the estate's accounts. Mr. Muir asked me to prepare them for His Grace's return. Has he returned? Constance asked quickly. Fiona's expression did not change. No, my lady, not yet. She placed the ledger on the table, lowering her voice. But something's amiss here. Numbers altered, names erased. I've kept the books for 30 years. This is not the hand of honest work. Constance leaned forward. The ink across the pages told a quiet story of deceit. Lines redrawn, totals shifted, payments recorded twice. Some names she recognized from her brief visit to the village. Crofters, who had spoken of higher rents and land lost. Beside the ledger lay a folded scrap of parchment, its edges smudged with soot. Fiona hesitated before handing it over. I found this tucked inside the binding, she said. Constance unfolded it carefully. It was a crude map, no larger than her palm, drawn in black charcoal. A thin line marked a river bending between two hills, ending in a cross beneath what looked like a mound of stones. The cairn. Her breath caught. This is the place I saw today. Fiona's brow furrowed. Then whoever drew it knew more than they ought. Before Constance could answer, a sharp rap echoed against the doorframe. Ewan stood there, his cap in hand, rain dripping from his shoulders. Forgive the intrusion, he said, glancing between them, but there's something your grace should hear. Fiona stiffened. You were told not to enter the main house without summons. I was, Ewan replied, his tone grave. But the hills don't wait for summons. He stepped closer, his limp more noticeable now in the lamplight. The crofters speak of men seen near the boundary wall after dark. Men who don't carry the Duke's crest, nor his purpose. They say the factor meets them by torchlight, trading papers sealed with wax, not of Strathden's make. Constance's heart quickened. What kind of papers? Deeds, perhaps, or bargains? Ewan's gaze fixed on the ledger. Whatever he's selling, it isn't grain or timber. He means to carve the land piece by piece, to devour it. Fiona crossed herself. Saints preserve us. Constance rose from her chair. You're certain? I've lived long enough to know the smell of betrayal. His eyes softened, if only slightly. His Grace trusted Muir once. That trust will cost more than coin if it's not stopped. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and the candlelight flickered. The moment held like a held breath. Finally, Constance spoke, her voice calm but unyielding. Then it must be stopped, quietly but soon. Ewan inclined his head, his jaw tight. You've courage, my lady. Perhaps too much for this place. When he turned to leave, she caught the faintest trace of something familiar in his movement, the way he leaned on his walking stick, the measured silence of his steps. It struck her suddenly. He moved like the shadow she had seen that night beyond her window. After he was gone, she stood by the fire, listening to the distant echo of his cane against the flagstones, each sound fading slower than the last. Outside, the rain had ceased. But somewhere across the moor, a figure moved once more, carrying a walking stick that glinted briefly beneath the moonlight. The castle slept, but the truth beneath its stone was awake. The key was heavy, cold, and tarnished with age. It had hung from Fiona's ring for decades, untouched. When the old housekeeper placed it in Constance's gloved hand, her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, more solemn. A truth, long buried beneath layers of stone, silence and duty, was now being passed into her keeping. "The chapel's been locked since his Grace's father passed," Fiona murmured. "No one's entered since the old laird's funeral. He was the last to believe in prayer more than politics." Constance nodded, her breath shallow. "And the Duke?" Fiona hesitated. "The Duke kept the key but never crossed its threshold." Rain tapped gently at the high windows as Constance made her way down the west corridor. The air was cooler there, the scent of damp stone and aged pine stronger. The castle shifted subtly in that part of the house, less polished, more sacred. The walls bore older tapestries, their threads faded to ghosts of what had once been crimson and gold. At the end of the corridor, past a set of iron sconces no longer lit, stood a door of dark oak, reinforced with iron bands and worn by time. She inserted the key. It turned with effort, a slow, resistant groan, and when the lock finally gave way, a gust of stale air swept outward like the exhalation of something long dormant. The chapel had not been touched in over a decade. Dust floated like ash in the slanted shafts of light that poured through stained glass, their colours dulled by time. Wooden pews stood in disciplined rows, many warped by moisture. An altar of grey stone waited at the far end beneath a carved crucifix, the figure of Christ weathered but solemn. Ivy had crept in through the cracked panes and wound its way along the baseboards, as if nature itself had reached inside to reclaim the forgotten. Yet it was not death that lingered in the air, it was memory. Constance moved forward with reverence. Her boots echoed faintly as she passed down the aisle, trailing her fingertips along the edge of the pews. On the wall to the left, covered by a moth-eaten tapestry, she discovered a row of portraits, once framed and hung with pride. She pulled back the cloth slowly. Faces stared back at her. Not noblemen, not ladies in lace or powdered wigs. Farmers, weavers, women holding children, men in coarse jackets standing stiffly beside their families. The names beneath were Gaelic, their years noted by hand: Donachide, Macaulay, Seniag, Lachlan, all dated before 1847, the year the evictions began. Her throat tightened. Each face was a story that had been silenced. The gallery was a memorial, not to grandeur, but to loss. She turned to the altar. A candle sat in an iron holder, long melted into a puddle of wax. She knelt slowly, unsure why, instinct perhaps, or the solemnity of the space, and noticed that one of the floor tiles beneath the altar had shifted slightly. Her fingers pressed along the edges, and with a faint click the tile lifted. Inside was a hollowed space, and within it a box of dark cedar. She drew it out with both hands. Her pulse echoed in her ears. The box opened with a whisper. Inside lay a folded letter, its edges yellowed, its seal bearing the stag and blade, the crest of the House of Macraig. The handwriting was unmistakable. "My wife," it began. "If you have found this, then you have stepped into the silence I once entered and could not bear to break. I left not out of cowardice, but to shield you from a truth that would have marked you before your vows had even dried." Constance's breath caught. They want the land, but they do not want the people. They want Strathden stripped of its soul, emptied of those who remember what came before. Muir is only one of many hands in this. The syndicate pays him to clear the crofters and erase their names as though they were stains. If I had stayed, they would have made me complicit. If I had spoken, they would have silenced me. She closed her eyes, steadying the storm that now gathered in her chest. "But I fear I have left you alone among wolves. This place is no longer safe for innocence, only for resolve. You may yet save what I could not. But you must do it in silence and strength until the time to speak arrives. If you find this letter, know this: I married you to shield the estate, not because I saw you as a tool, but because I had read of your refusal to betray a child under your care, even when threatened with prison. That courage is what Strathden needs. Her vision blurred, the world around her tilted, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. She had not been chosen to be a duchess. She had been chosen to be a blade, silent, patient, sharp. Beneath the letter lay another folded page, thinner parchment, legal in tone. She opened it carefully. It was a copy of the marriage contract. Her eyes scanned it rapidly, her gaze halting on a passage near the end. In the event of the legal or physical absence of the Duke of Strathden, full stewardship of estate matters, both civil and financial, shall fall to the Duchess, Constance Vale, for a period not exceeding 1 calendar year, with renewal upon public declaration of ducal incapacity. She drew in a breath so sharp it trembled in her chest. She was not merely his bride. She was now the legal steward of Strathden, and the wolves had no idea the lamb had been given the keys to the gate. A faint creak made her turn sharply. Dust swirled at the far end of the chapel, though no wind blew. Perhaps just the old stones shifting, but her nerves were taut. She gathered the box in her arms and stood. Before leaving, she glanced once more at the portraits. One woman held a child with the same hazel eyes that stared from Constance's reflection. Could it be that she, too, was born of this soil in some forgotten way? Back in her chamber, Fiona waited beside the hearth, her eyes widening when Constance entered carrying the cedar box. "Good God," the housekeeper whispered. "You found it." Constance nodded. "You knew?" "I suspected. His Grace once told me the chapel kept more than prayers." Fiona stepped closer. "But he never said what." Wordlessly, Constance laid the contract on the table. Fiona read it, her eyes narrowing. When she looked up, there was no doubt in her voice. "Then you are more than a guest here. You're the one with the power to stop what Muir has begun." Constance folded the letter and the contract with care and slid them into a hidden compartment in her writing desk. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." Outside, the wind swept across the moors in long, mournful sighs, but within her, something had shifted. She no longer wandered a castle of ghosts. She walked now with purpose, every footstep an echo of the women whose portraits still hung in the dark. She would not be erased. Not she. Not Strathden. The fog came down like a shroud that morning, thick and slow, rolling in from the hills until it swallowed the castle in pale silence. It clung to the windows, blurring the view of the moors, and softened every sound within the stone walls, as though the world itself had decided to whisper. Constance Vale, now no longer merely the Duchess in name but in resolve, stood in the long gallery overlooking the courtyard. Below, men moved in near silence, stable boys leading ponies through the mist, a few workers hauling sacks toward the granary. From this height, they resembled shadows in search of purpose. She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass, watching the way the fog curved around the distant pines. Since the chapel discovery, her heart no longer beat with uncertainty, but with measured determination. She now knew what she must do, and it would begin that very evening with a supper. A gathering of crofters had not occurred within the great hall of Strathden Castle in over 20 years, not since the elder Duke had presided over the estate with a blend of Highland pride and iron discipline. The current Duke, her absent husband, had chosen retreat and secrecy, but Constance would not. She would speak to the people herself, see their faces, listen to the truths that had been buried beneath titles and ledgers. Fiona had offered her a dozen reasons why it was ill-advised. "The crofters will not speak freely in your presence," she warned. "They are wary of titles, and more so of sudden kindness, especially now." "Then I will let my questions speak for me," Constance replied, "and my silence when it is time to listen." Fiona had stared at her then with a curious, searching gaze. Something flickered in her expression. doubt perhaps, or admiration reluctantly blooming. The supper was held in the smaller hall, a long chamber with oak beams darkened by candle soot and banners bearing the faded crest of the MacCraigs. Constance had ordered a modest meal, fresh bannocks, boiled potatoes, venison stew, and cider brewed from the old orchard behind the chapel walls. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that would insult the people she meant to reach. They came slowly, in pairs and trios, faces weathered by sun and sorrow, hands calloused, backs bent from years of labour the aristocracy never cared to see. They nodded politely, removed their hats, and stood clustered near the walls, unsure of where to sit. Constance, standing at the head of the table, gestured with quiet dignity. "Please," she said, "this is your table as well." Her voice did not command, but invited, and slowly they obeyed. There were nearly 30 of them by the time the hall had settled, men and women, young and old. Children stayed home, though a few peeked through the door before being gently ushered back into the mist by elder siblings. Among the gathered was Ewan Fergus, his frame unmistakable even in the gloom. He sat near the hearth, one leg stretched carefully before him, the walking stick resting beside his chair like a second spine. Candles flickered above them, catching the faces in golden light. And then she spoke. No speech, no declarations, only questions. "How long have your families worked this land? What changes have you seen in the rents? When did the evictions begin?" One by one the answers came. Hesitant at first, clipped, but then bolder, clearer. A crofter named Rona, her apron still dusted with flour, spoke of her mother losing her grazing rights 2 years past. A fisherman named Merrick told of new tolls along the riverbank, demanded by men with no Highland names. And an old shepherd whispered of a lease revoked without cause, his flock scattered, his kin gone to Glasgow in search of factory work. Throughout it all, Mr. Muir was never named directly, but he was there, in every silence, every bitterness that curled at the edges of the villagers' words, a presence invisible and oppressive, like a shadow cast without light. As the supper drew to a close, Constance stood. "I cannot promise that I will repair what has been broken," she said softly, "but I will not turn from it." A long silence followed. Then Ewan's voice, quiet and rough. "Sometimes all folk need is to be seen, not saved. Just seen." Constance met his gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding born not of agreement, but of equal burden. Later, after the last crofter had stepped into the fog, Fiona approached her in the corridor. "You've stirred something tonight, my lady," she said, folding a towel in her hands. "And not only among the villagers." "What do you mean?" Fiona hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Someone within these walls tells Muir what is said and done. I've seen it before. Words whispered in confidence, appearing on his lips the very next day. Be careful where you place your trust." Constance felt the chill return, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that even within the stone safety of the castle, her every move might be measured. She nodded once. "Then it is time we give them something worth reporting." That very night, after the hall had emptied and the kitchen fires died to embers, she summoned Ewan to her chamber. He arrived mud-spattered and wind-chafed, but his eyes were clear. "There's a solicitor in Inverness," she told him. "His name is Edgar Wells, an old contact from my family's former days, trustworthy. I need this letter in his hands." She slid a sealed parchment across the table. "It outlines what I've seen, what I suspect, and requests that he prepare inquiries into any false filings made under the Strathden name." Ewan picked up the envelope and tucked it carefully beneath his coat. "I'll leave at first light," he said, "or before if the fog lets me through." She nodded, then stepped back, but not before their hands brushed briefly as he turned. The contact was accidental, but its effect was not. He looked at her then, not as a servant to a mistress, nor as a commoner to a noblewoman, but as a man who had learned to measure hearts by silence. "I'll return in 2 days' time, if the road is kind. I'll be waiting," she answered, "and so will the truth." When he left, The fog pressed even harder against the castle walls. That night, sleep did not come easily. Constance lay in her bed, the drapes of her canopy half drawn, watching the soft shadows dance across the ceiling. Her mind wandered beyond the stone, beyond the ledger, beyond even the supper. She saw him, the Duke, not as a memory, but as a figure walking through fire and mist. His face lined with weariness, his eyes the same as in the portrait above the hearth, yet deeper, darker. He reached for her across the dream, his hand streaked with ash. And just before she could speak his name, he vanished into smoke. When she awoke, her palms were cold. 2 days passed, no message, no word. On the third morning, as dawn barely lit the horizon, a shout came from the outer gate. Fiona ran to the courtyard. Constance followed, heart racing. There, supported by 2 crofters, stood Ewan, bloodied, his coat torn, one eye nearly swollen shut. He said nothing, but in his clenched hand he still held the letter, sealed, unbroken. And as they led him inside, Constance saw the bruise on his temple, the torn collar, the dried blood across his knuckles. And she heard him whisper one word beneath his breath, as though it burned to speak it, English. The fog had brought more than silence. It had brought enemies. The morning began in unnatural silence. Even the birds seemed to withhold their song, as though the weight of the day had pressed its hush upon the land. From the east, the sky swelled with the promise of a storm, the clouds thick and brooding above the moors of Strathden. Wind whispered through the corridors of the castle like a prophecy, stirring the curtains and slipping under doors like something alive. Constance Vale, Duchess of Strathden by name and now by right, stood in the centre of the great hall, a place once reserved for coronations, farewells and mourning. That morning it would bear witness to something different. Truth. She wore no jewels, no silks. Her gown was deep charcoal grey, simple in design but regal in posture. Her hair had been braided and pinned with care, though a single wisp had escaped and brushed against her cheek as if resisting too much perfection. Around her shoulders hung a Highland shawl of faded green and gold, colours of the Macraig crest, offered to her by Fiona not with ceremony, but with quiet approval. The great doors opened slowly, and the people entered. One by one they came, crofters, tenants, blacksmiths, weavers and their families. They filled the room with cautious eyes and solemn faces. Many had never stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the main hall. They had passed by it, prayed outside it, whispered about what might lie within, but they had never been invited, until now. Ewan stood quietly at the back, his face still bruised from the attack days prior, his walking stick planted firmly against the floor like a staff of warning. Beside him, Fiona's presence was as solid as the stone under their feet. She carried a thick bundle of ledgers, bound with twine and dust. At the far end of the room, just behind a line of iron-gilded chairs, stood Mr. Edwin Muir, dressed immaculately in black with a crimson cravat that looked more suited to a banker's funeral than to the Highland wind. His face held its usual expression of practiced civility, but his eyes betrayed calculation, and something else, wariness. Constance stepped forward, her hands clasped before her. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm and unwavering. "I do not ask for your faith, only for your time." A murmur passed through the hall. "I have walked your land," she continued. "I have heard your stories. I have seen the names scratched from records, the rents raised, the homes left to rot, and I have read the books. What remains of them?" Fiona stepped forward, untying the bundle and laying it upon the long oak table. Pages yellowed with age, ink smudged and overwritten. Some ledgers bore 2 sets of handwriting. Others had entire sections missing, but they were not blank. They were bleeding. "I do not accuse blindly," Constance said, "but I will not remain silent." She opened one ledger and turned it to the crowd. "This page lists rent due from 6 tenants in the North Quarter, but none of these people live there. I have spoken to the families myself. They were evicted last year, some without notice. Others were promised new leases that never came." She turned another page. This entry claims payment for timber sold to a buyer in Inverness, but the signature does not match the original merchant's seal. The price was inflated, the name altered. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. Some might say this is mismanagement. I say it is theft, not only of coin, but of dignity, of heritage. She lifted her chin, her voice now gathering wind. I was not born here. I came a stranger, but I have learned the names of your valleys. I have walked your rivers. I have stood at the cairn beneath the pines and listened to the silence where your ancestors once stood proud. And I tell you now, I will not let that silence remain. From the edge of the room, Muir stepped forward. Your Grace, he said smoothly. With respect, these documents are incomplete. Many were damaged by time, misplaced by careless hands. A duchess may have passion, but estate matters require reason, not sentiment. Constance looked at him evenly. Then let us be reasonable, Mr. Muir. Where are the original leases? Where are the receipts for the tolls imposed along the river path? Where are the names of those hired to evict families during the snow months? Muir smiled thinly. You assume much from fragments. I speak from what remains after you've taken the rest, she replied. He stepped closer, voice now low and sharp. And I remind your Grace that the Crown has entrusted this land to a duke, a man. Not to... Fiona's voice rang out like a bell. Enough! Every head turned. Fiona McCrae, the housekeeper who had spoken little, now stepped forward and stood beside Constance with the poise of a woman who remembered what pride felt like. I invoke the right of Bentigherna and Tigay, she declared. A collective gasp filled the hall. Even Muir paled slightly. It is the ancient law of stewardship, she continued, her voice steady. When the laird is absent and the land is threatened, the rightful lady may speak in his place, if her name has been entered in the contract and if the people bear witness. She turned to the crowd. You've seen her walk the land. You've heard her listen. You've watched her stay when most would flee. Does any among you deny her right? Silence. Then a murmur. Then heads began to nod. Muir's voice cracked like ice. These are old superstitions, long buried, but not forgotten, said Ewan, stepping forward, his bruised eye glinting, and never broken. The tension in the room stretched tight, pulled like a bowstring ready to snap. And then someone clapped, just once. A crofter named Rona. Then another joined, and another. Within moments, the hall thundered with applause, not wild but purposeful, like the sound of a storm building over the sea, quiet and inevitable. Constance did not smile. She only bowed her head. It was not victory. It was awakening. As the crowd began to disperse, families leaving with something in their eyes that had been absent for years. Hope. Fiona leaned in and whispered, You've given them breath again. But in that moment, a chill swept over Constance's shoulder. Her hand brushed against the edge of her cloak. Something had been tucked into it. She stepped into the shadows of the corridor and pulled it free. A folded slip of parchment, the ink still fresh. 4 words. Midnight. The cairn. Come alone. No signature, no seal, only silence waiting once more in the dark. The moon had risen behind a veil of clouds, casting only a pallid light upon the Highlands. The wind carried with it the scent of heather and something darker, like moss grown in shadow, untouched by sun. The world was suspended in a breathless hush, as if the earth itself awaited something long delayed. Constance Vale, Duchess of Strathden, walked alone through the moorland, her boots soundless upon the damp ground. The folded note inside her cloak pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Midnight. The cairn. Come alone. She had told no one, not even Fiona. She had slipped out after the castle had quieted, moving like a shadow through the servants' passage, her lantern hidden beneath a shawl. The silence of the land unnerved her, but she did not falter. Her feet knew the way now, carved into memory by letters, suspicions, and the slow-burning fire of purpose. The cairn rose ahead, ancient and silent beneath the sky, stones piled in reverent stillness, as though time itself had folded its arms and sat there waiting. She stopped, her breath caught somewhere between anticipation and fear, and then he stepped out from behind the cairn as if summoned by the wind. Alasdair Macraig, Duke of Strathden, not a ghost, not a memory, a man. He was leaner than the portrait in the drawing room, his face worn by the sun and the road. A full beard framed his mouth, and his dark hair was longer, tied at the nape. He wore no cravat, only a worn coat and thick wool cloak fastened by a brooch bearing his family's crest. Mud streaked the hem of his garments, but his bearing had not diminished. He stood as a man who had never yielded, though the cost was written in the lines beside his eyes. Constance could not move. Her throat tightened, but she would not speak first. Alasdair took a step forward, the light catching the silver in his hair. "I hoped you would come," he said softly. Constance's voice, when it came, was steady. "You left me a letter, not a choice." He nodded. "I did. I thought it kinder than the truth." "There is no kindness in silence." His gaze held hers. "Perhaps not, but there was survival, and for a time, that had to be enough." She took a breath, lifting her chin. "You have been seen, by more than just me. Crofters speak of a man in the woods. Guards have doubled. The factor grows more brazen." "I know," he said. "That's why I asked you here." She folded her arms, the chill of the night creeping into her sleeves. "So this is not an apology?" "No," he replied, his voice low. "It's an explanation." He gestured to a rock, and she hesitated before sitting. He sat opposite her, close but not too near. The wind curled between them, but the space crackled with a strange tension, like the space between a match and flame. "For the past months," Alasdair began, "I have been travelling under another name, between Inverness, Glasgow, and the northern borders. I followed shipments, intercepted letters, bribed the right men, and threatened the wrong ones. Muir is not acting alone. He is part of a syndicate, based in Glasgow, backed by foreign investors, who intend to strip Strathden of its crofters, sell the land in parcels, and profit from its timber and mineral rights." Constance's stomach turned. "Then he has already begun?" "Yes," Alasdair said grimly. "The papers are nearly ready. If I had returned too soon, they would have denied it and sealed the records. I needed names, signatures. I have them now." He reached into his satchel and pulled a packet of folded documents, tied with twine. "Proof," he said. "Receipts, contracts, lists of families targeted for forced removal, and ledgers, doctored to hide the transfers." She reached out and took them, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. "Now, I return. Officially. I name what has been done and demand it undone." Her breath caught. "You think that will be enough?" "No," he said, "but I think it will begin something that must end." The wind howled suddenly, lifting the ends of her cloak. She clutched it around herself and looked at him. Really looked at him. His hands were calloused, his eyes ringed with fatigue. He had not been hiding in comfort, but surviving on the edge of ruin. He had not abandoned her for convenience, but for war. Still, her voice was quiet when she spoke. "You left me on our wedding night. Without even a goodbye." He looked away for a moment, then met her gaze. "I thought you'd be safer without me." "You thought wrong." They sat in silence, the night pressing close. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded page. She handed it to him, her hand trembling only slightly. "I wrote this the night you disappeared," she said. "I never sent it. I didn't know where to send it." He unfolded the page, his eyes moving over her handwriting. When he reached the end, he drew a breath as though the air itself had thickened. "If you are not dead, fight beside me. I will not run." Alasdair looked up, and for the first time, the stoicism in his features cracked. He swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought I had condemned you to isolation." "You did," she said, "but I made something of it." His jaw tensed. You deserved more. I still do, she said quietly. But I will not wait for it. I will claim it. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, yes, but also admiration, something warmer. I underestimated you, he said. And I didn't know you, she replied. Not really, but I begin to. The words hung in the air like an unfinished vow. A branch snapped nearby. Both turned, only a deer darting across the ridge. Still, the moment had shifted. The silence between them was no longer filled with absence. It was filled with choice. He stood. I leave before dawn. I'll return to the castle by noon. I'll do it as myself. She rose too. Then be ready. They will not receive you kindly. I don't ask for kindness, he said, his voice low. Only truth. They stood a moment longer, the wind pressing at their backs. Then, as she turned to go, he spoke again. Constance. She looked over her shoulder. You said you would not run. I won't, she said. And then she disappeared into the mist. The Duke remained behind, standing at the cairn beneath the Highland sky, the letter still in his hand. The storm had gathered, yes, but so had something else, resolve, and perhaps something that might one day become love. The first sign was the smell. Long before the bells rang, before the shouting tore through the stillness of morning, Constance Vale awoke to the scent of smoke. It crept through the corridors of Strathden Castle like a serpent, curling beneath doors and rising in the folds of velvet drapery. At first, she thought it part of some dream, a memory perhaps, or an omen, but then came the cries. From the courtyard below, the shouts were rising. She threw open the window, and the wind that struck her was full of ash. To the north, across the ridge, a column of black smoke coiled into the pale Highland sky. Flames licked the horizon in the direction of the village mill, once the pride of the crofters, built stone by stone with their own hands and passed through 3 generations. Now it burned. The servants were already rushing through the hallways, confusion and panic etched across their faces. Fiona's voice called out orders from the main stairwell. Someone rang the chapel bell, its long-forgotten toll echoing across the moor like a warning from another century. Constance was halfway down the stairs when she met Ewan, breathless and grim, a soot-streaked cloth wrapped around his neck. "It's the mill," he said, set ablaze before dawn. "Muir blames the crofters." "No," she breathed. "He wouldn't dare. He already has." They reached the great hall, where Fiona met them with red cheeks and a glare of steel in her eyes. He sent word to Inverness. Claims rebellion, arson, insurrection. Constance's heart raced. And the villagers? Frightened, divided. Some say it's vengeance for the evictions. Others think it's a trap, but no one's safe now. A servant burst through the door, his hair slick with sweat. "Mr. Muir has summoned guards from the city. They'll arrive by nightfall." Constance turned to Ewan, her voice low but fierce. "Get me one of the men who helped him. Anyone willing to speak." He nodded once and disappeared like a shadow. The sun had not yet fully risen when she climbed the steps to the gallery, smoke still drifting past the windows like spectres of war. She looked out across the estate, her hands clenched at her sides. The flames in the distance had dimmed, but their message had already spread like wildfire. Chaos had returned to Strathden. By midday, the castle was surrounded. Carriages had arrived from Inverness bearing men in red coats, mercenaries disguised as lawmen, stationed under Muir's command. They stood at the gates like silent hounds, rifles strapped across their chests. Villagers dared not approach. Then came Muir himself. He entered the castle with a letter in one hand and false courtesy in the other. Constance waited in the great hall, her chin high, her back straight. She would not tremble before a man who dressed treachery in black silk. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, bowing. "A pity we meet under such circumstances." "Is it?" she replied. "You seem very well prepared for tragedy." He raised an eyebrow. "It is not I who summoned chaos. You opened the doors. You stirred the people. You questioned the ledgers. I revealed the truth," she said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And for that, You will face consequences." At that moment, the door burst open. Ewan entered, supporting a man barely able to stand, a younger crofter with torn sleeves and a bruised face. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, but in his eyes was something clear: courage. Constance moved forward. "Tell them," she said gently. The crofter nodded, his voice raw. "I was hired to set the fire." Gasps rippled through the servants gathered near the hall's edges. "I was paid in coin by a man with an English accent," the boy continued. "Told to blame the villagers if asked. Threatened if I didn't follow through." Constance turned to Muir, her gaze sharp as frost. "This is your rebellion." Muir did not blink. He merely lifted the letter in his hand. "Then you may take it up with the magistrate," he said. "He arrives within the hour." And he turned and left, his coat trailing behind him like a serpent's tail. The hall was heavy with dread. Fiona stepped forward. "We must bring him down, but we need power." And then the doors opened again, not with panic, but with presence. He entered like thunder in silence. Alasdair MacCraig, Duke of Strathden, strode through the great hall for the first time in nearly a year. Clad in full Highland dress, tartan draped over one shoulder, black jacket polished, boots dusted from travel, he walked with the command of a man who had not been broken by absence, but forged by it. Gasps echoed from every corner of the room. Constance stepped back as he ascended the dais beside her. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he turned to the gathered crowd and lifted his voice. "I am Alasdair MacCraig, rightful Duke of Strathden. I return not in exile, but in purpose. And I stand beside my wife, Constance Vale MacCraig, Duchess of Strathden, not as a figurehead, but as steward, as guardian, and as equal in every word and deed spoken since I left." Murmurs turned to affirmations. Some wept. He turned to her at last, his eyes softening. "Together we will undo what has been done." But there was no time for celebration. The magistrate arrived shortly after, flanked by guards. A man with a hollow face and papers already signed. The kind of man who believed truth could be rewritten if printed in enough ink. He read the charges with no hesitation. "Constance Vale MacCraig, Duchess of Strathden, you are hereby placed under arrest for incitement to rebellion, interference with estate matters under Crown authority, and unlawful gathering of tenants against the will of the appointed factor." Gasps erupted. Alasdair stepped forward. "She is my wife." "She is not the Duke," the magistrate replied coldly. "And she will answer before the Crown." Guards moved toward her. Constance stood tall, her hands unclenched. "I will not resist." "No," Alasdair said sharply, stepping beside her. "But you will not stand alone." Their eyes met. No words were needed. As she was led out of the hall, the crofters lined the corridor in silence, men and women who had once feared, now filled with fire. Children watched from staircases. Ewan stood by the gate, jaw set, eyes blazing. Fiona held her shawl close, lips pressed together, but her gaze never leaving Constance. Outside, the sky had darkened, and thunder rolled across the distant hills. The storm had arrived, but the hearts of Strathden had already begun to rise. The stone courthouse in Inverness loomed grey against a morning sky thick with clouds. A slow rain misted the air, blurring the outlines of carriages and men in dark coats who gathered outside the arched entrance. Inside, the hall was cold and hollow, its air tinged with the scent of damp wool, scorched lamp oil, and something far older, like dust from parchment that had judged too many fates without mercy. Constance Vale MacCraig, Duchess of Strathden, stood alone in the dock. Her gown was of plain wool, the deep forest green faded by the journey and the sleepless nights behind her, yet she wore it with the dignity of a queen. Her hair was swept back into a modest twist, and her gloved hands rested at her sides, unmoving. No jewellery adorned her fingers, no veil softened her expression. Only her eyes spoke, clear, unflinching and unwavering, though every breath she took echoed like a challenge in the silent chamber. Before her sat Magistrate Urquhart, a man of narrow shoulders and a mouth set permanently in suspicion. He had read the charges with the monotone cadence of a man used to obeying ink and wax rather than human conscience. Incitement to rebellion, obstruction of Crown-appointed authority, and the unlawful assembly of tenants. He now peered at her over his spectacles, as if searching for guilt woven into the very fabric of her dress. To his left, Muir sat flanked by two redcoats. His face bore no trace of the confident smirk that once haunted the corridors of Strathden. He kept his hands clasped before him, but his boots tapped faintly under the bench, an unconscious betrayal. The chamber filled slowly. Villagers, crofters, merchants from the outer glens, even a few of the lesser gentry, had come. Some stood, some pressed against the windows, their breath fogging the panes. All watched in silence. The first witness was a shepherd with rough hands and a woolen cap clutched against his chest. "She didn't incite us," he said. "She listened. That's all. Listened when no one else would." Next came Mrs. Dalrymple, a widow of 73, with a spine straighter than most soldiers. "She brought bread to my hearth when my son was turned off the land. A rebel doesn't do that. A leader might." One by one, they came. Women and men, heads bowed, yet voices steady. They spoke of her courage, her presence, her refusal to flee when she could have. They spoke not of rebellion, but of dignity. The turning point came with the final witness. The chamber fell still as Ewan Fergus was led forward. His limp was worse than before, the bruises on his temple dark beneath the lamplight. Yet he held himself tall. In his hands he carried a folded confession and the cracked leather satchel taken from the mercenary captured at the cairn. "I was there," he said, voice gravelled but clear. "I heard them say it, that Muir paid them, that he planned to burn the mill, blame the crofters and pressure the sale." Gasps rippled through the gallery. He handed the confession to the magistrate. "It's signed, and the coin used for payment, minted in London." Urquhart's eyes narrowed. "And yet you bring no solicitor, no noble sponsor, no signatory of the Crown to confirm your rights. Are we to convict a Crown factor on hearsay and crofter's loyalty?" The silence that followed was thick. Constance's breath caught. She knew what this was, a trap of silence woven from bureaucracy and bias. And then the doors opened. All turned. Alasdair MacCraig, Duke of Strathden, entered in full Highland regalia. His presence was like a bell rung across still waters. He wore the black watch tartan draped over his left shoulder, pinned by the brooch of Clan MacCraig. His boots struck the stone with measured rhythm. A dirk hung at his hip. Behind him 2 Highlanders followed, bearing satchels and a weathered chest. Urquhart stood. "This is a court of law, not a parade ground." Alasdair stopped before the magistrate, unhurried. "Then you shall want proof more than pomp." He opened the chest. From within he withdrew 3 documents, each sealed and stamped. "The first," he said, lifting the first scroll, "is the original marriage contract, witnessed and signed under ecclesiastical and legal authority, confirming the Duchess's lawful rights over Strathden in my absence." He unrolled the second. "The second is a set of deeds, altered by Muir's hand, traced by forensics in Edinburgh, forged to undermine communal holdings and push through private sale." He let the silence hang, then lifted the third scroll. "And this is from the Lord Advocate of Scotland, bearing the Crown's seal. It affirms both the contract and our legal stewardship of the land, together." He stepped closer to Constance. "Together," he repeated, not to the court, but to her. Her breath trembled. He did not touch her. He didn't need to. Urquhart studied the documents, turning pale at the third seal. He looked from the scrolls to Muir. "Is there anything you wish to present in your defence, sir?" Muir rose, his voice thin. "It was her. She played the people against me, lied, manipulated." "No," Urquhart cut in, "you lied, and you will answer for it." He turned to the guards. "Seize him!" Muir cried out as the redcoats stepped forward. His shouts echoed against the walls before dissolving into silence. The chamber watched as he was led away, his boots no longer tapping, his hands now bound. Urquhart looked back at Constance. All charges are dropped. You are free, Your Grace. But she did not smile. Not yet. It was only when the crofters began to clap, when Fiona stepped from the shadows to stand beside her, that Constance allowed herself to breathe. Applause grew like wind gathering across the loch. The people rose, not as rebels, but as witnesses to justice earned, not granted. Later, as the hall cleared and lamps burned low, Fiona returned to Constance's side. They stood beneath the high windows where rain still whispered against the glass. Fiona reached out and laid a gentle hand on Constance's abdomen. It was a brief touch, barely a moment, but her eyes glistened with something unspoken. Constance froze, not in fear, but wonder. Her hand moved instinctively to rest over Fiona's. Fiona gave her a knowing smile. "Not everything begins in fire," she murmured. "Some things begin in the quiet." Across the room, Alasdair waited, speaking softly with Ewan. But Constance remained where she was, her hand over her womb, her breath shallow. Not everything begins in fire, and not every trial ends with a verdict. Some end with a heartbeat, a promise, a future unfolding in silence. And that, too, was victory. The winds that once howled through the glens now carried the laughter of children and the lowing of cattle across sunlit pastures. 1 year had passed since the trial, and Strathden had awoken from its long sleep like a moorland after rain, softened, green, and breathing anew. Where once tension had hung heavy as mist over heather, now life stirred in every corner of the estate. The crofters' cottages had been repaired, their thatch gleaming gold under the spring sun. New tools had been forged, new fields turned. The chapel was open once more, its door unbarred, the pews filled with the songs of harvest blessings and baptisms. At the heart of it all stood Constance, no longer a stranger, no longer a bride bought and forgotten. She walked the land with a quiet strength, born not of title but of presence. The people called her Our Lady, not out of obligation, but reverence. It was a day of celebration. In the orchard behind the main house, beneath the wide-limbed rowan tree that had withstood centuries of storms, the crofters had gathered. Tables were laid with linen and heather, the scent of oatcakes and smoked salmon mingling with the clean perfume of gorse blossoms. Strings of ribbons fluttered from branches, children wove crowns of daisies, music floated from a fiddler perched atop a stone wall, his bow dancing with each breath of breeze. At the center of the gathering, a makeshift altar of stacked stones had been raised, an echo of the cairn where secrets had once slept beneath the earth. Now it would witness something far different. Alasdair MacCraig, Duke of Strathden, stood beside Constance, his hand lightly covering hers. His hair was longer than it had been that first night, wind-tossed and streaked with early silver, and his eyes held the humility of a man who had come to understand the weight of his own land, and the woman who had stood in its stead when he could not. He wore no sword, no sash, only a plain jacket of rough wool and a thistle pinned to his breast. And Constance, she wore a gown the colour of soft earth and summer moss. Not the fashion of London or court, but of the Highlands. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, her hands bare, and her cheeks flushed not with cosmetics, but sunlight and joy. At her neckline, a small silver locket rested, the one that once held her mother's likeness, now holding something newer, a lock of her daughter's hair. The infant, barely able to sit upright, squirmed gently in Fiona's arms. She had Alasdair's mouth and Constance's eyes. A soft coo escaped her lips, as if she too were trying to speak her blessing. The child's bonnet had fallen back, revealing fine curls like copper kissed by firelight. Fiona, who had never claimed the word mother, cradled the child with a care that needed no name. The ceremony was brief, without clergy or proclamation. Only the people, the tree and the Highland wind bore witness. "I did not choose you," Constance said softly, her voice steady but thick with feeling. "But I stayed, and staying was my choice. Every day after was mine, and today again I choose you." Alistair looked at her as if she were a miracle he still did not deserve. "I failed you," he replied, "and you taught me that honor is not in hiding, but in standing beside the fire and staying even when it burns. I choose you, Mograd." She leaned forward then, not for a kiss, but for a touch of foreheads, a Highland vow, older than ink and paper. From the gathered crowd, a crofter began to hum an old tune, low and melodic. One by one, others joined. The song rose, not a hymn, not a ballad, but something between, a memory passed through generations, carried in blood and breath. As the vows ended, Ewan stepped forward. His limp had worsened, but his eyes gleamed. He held a carved cradle in his hands, an heirloom he had restored himself. He bowed low as he presented it to Constance. "For the daughter of the land," he said, voice thick. Fiona passed the infant into her mother's arms. Constance held the child close, her lips pressed to her daughter's temple. The little one grasped at her locket, then at her father's sleeve, content in the warmth that surrounded her. They lingered beneath the rowan tree, not rushed by duty or fear. The people feasted, laughed, toasted. The guards, no longer outsiders but kin, stood without rifles. The land, once marked for sale and silence, had become a sanctuary. At dusk, as the sun bled gold across the glen, Constance carried her daughter back into the nursery. It was a simple room, wooden floors, a hearth already glowing, curtains of blue linen swaying in the breeze. Upon a carved table near the cradle sat a small cedar box, its lid etched with a rowan branch. Inside lay 2 letters. The first was old, creased, and sealed in velvet. His words, written the night he disappeared. The plea to trust, to follow the river, to believe in a future not yet revealed. The second was hers, unsent. A confession of longing and fury, of pain and faith, of choosing to stay when running had been so much easier. Constance opened the box and placed a third item inside, a blank page wrapped in a ribbon, the color of her daughter's eyes. "Someday," she whispered to the child in her arms, "you'll write your own." The infant's fingers curled, as if in reply, around the 2 letters, joining them at last. In the quiet of the room, Alistair stepped behind them, wrapping one arm around Constance's waist. His other hand rested gently over hers, both their palms cupping their daughter. Outside, the orchard swayed in the wind. Inside, legacy took root, not in war, not in title, but in love that had bled, endured, and been reborn. And beneath the rowan tree, the wind whispered once more, not of sorrow or secrets, but of something stronger. Home. The hills of Strathden wore their golden coats once more, a quilt of ochre, rust and fire trembling beneath the crisp kiss of early frost. 8 harvests had passed since the trial in Inverness, and the land remembered. Every storm, every vow, every silence that had once choked the valleys and now echoed with life. Constance MacCraig, Duchess of Strathden, stood at the edge of the orchard beneath the old rowan tree, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching her children play. The years had touched her gently. A few silver strands glinted through her chestnut hair. Her hands bore the calluses of work well chosen, and her gaze held the calm gravity of a woman who had suffered, led, loved, and survived. At her feet ran Isla, 8 years old and flame-haired, bold of spirit and voice. She was the girl who had once curled her fingers around 2 letters sealed in wax, and now recited poetry to sheep and argued justice with her tutors. At her heels followed Fergus, barely 5, already serious, already asking too many questions about how grain was taxed and why birds did not obey fences. From the croft paths below, Alistair approached, a basket of apples slung over one shoulder, his beard streaked with grey, his smile unchanged. He still woke early, still walked the fields, still kissed his wife on the temple before every meal, as though no other habit could anchor the world. "Will they ever tire of that tree?" he asked softly. Constance shook her head with quiet affection. No more than we ever did. Their fingers intertwined. Behind them, Strathden Castle no longer loomed like a monument to lost pride. Its windows shone with light and warmth. The schoolroom had grown into a learning hall. The chapel's once abandoned altar now welcomed births and weddings. A weekly market had taken root in the village square, where crofters sold wool, bread and songs. And yet, not all was joy. Mr. Muir, long imprisoned, had died 2 years after his sentencing. Alone, forgotten by those he had served, feared by those he had betrayed. Not even his estate solicitors came to collect his remains. The final irony. A man who wished to empty the Highlands was buried in Highland soil. Fiona, aging but sharp as the wind off the sea, still ran the household. Her knees ached now, and her hearing waned, but no one dared cross her. She had chosen to remain unmarried, though the blacksmith had asked twice. She said she had raised a duchess and 2 bairns. What other joy could compare? Ewan Fergus had gone mostly blind that last winter, but each Sunday he sat in the sun with Isla at his feet, telling her tales of the tunnel, the trial, the day her mother faced down redcoats with only a ledger in hand. The girl knew them all by heart. And as for Constance and Alasdair, time had neither cooled nor dimmed the quiet intensity that lived in the small gestures. The way she reached for his cup before he asked, the way he touched her waist when he passed behind her in the study, the way they still argued in whispers so their children would never hear the bite of past grief. Their love had not grown louder, it had grown truer. At night, when the candles burned low and the household had settled, they would still walk the halls of Strathden hand in hand. Sometimes she would pause before the nursery door and listen to the soft breathing of their children. Sometimes he would stop at the hidden tunnel's entrance, sealed now with stone and a brass plate that read, "Justice was born in silence." Their greatest triumph was not the estate's return to glory. It was that the land was shared, the leases held not by fear but by mutual promise. The syndicates had not returned, the papers in London no longer printed doom for the Highlands. Strathden had become a model for others, proof that dignity and land could live together. On the night of their 9th wedding anniversary, Alasdair brought her a gift. It was not jewels or lace, but a 3rd letter, one he had written after Isla's birth, but never shared. It told of the night he first saw her sleeping in the great bed of Strathden, her brow furrowed even in dreams, and realized he would never again have peace if she did not find it too. Constance placed that letter beside the first 2 in the cedar box. 3 letters now, 3 voices, 3 acts of love. As autumn waned and winter crept near, a soft snow fell over the Highlands, dusting the rowan tree like sugar on a cake. Beneath it, Isla buried a small tin box of her own, filled with pressed flowers, a feather, and a note that read, "Someday I'll be Duchess too." Constance watched her daughter from the window, her hand resting over her heart. The past no longer ruled Strathden. It lived here, yes, but in memory, not in chains. And the future? It danced through the fields in muddy boots and mismatched gloves, asking bold questions and planting new seeds. The house would grow quiet again, the orchard would sleep. But the love that had once been a bargain now bloomed in every corner of the land, in every cradled child, in every fire lit against the cold. Some stories end with a kiss, theirs endured. Some stories are not told with trumpets or triumphs, but with quiet defiance, tender hands, and the strength to love where others would run. The Duchess of Strathden is one such story. It speaks to every soul that has been underestimated, every woman told she was only a pawn, every heart that dared to hold on, even in silence. Through Constance and Alasdair, we are reminded that love is not just passion or poetry. Love is stewardship. Love is choosing someone again and again, even after the world has broken your faith. Love is rebuilding, brick by brick, letter by letter, day by unrelenting day. If this tale moved you, left a mark on your heart, or brought tears to your eyes, let us know in the comments. And if you read all the way to the end, write the word Rowan below. It's our secret sign, a whisper across time, to show that you too believe in love that endures. If you'd like to support the storytellers and artists behind this channel, your super thanks, no matter the amount, means the world to us. Truly. And if you're not in a place to give financially, you can still help this story travel far and wide. Share it with a friend, a sister, a mother, someone who needs to believe that even in the harshest winters, a green gathering waits on the other side. And before you go, don't miss the other period dramas we've lovingly created. You'll find links in the cards and the end screen. Each one carries its own storm, its own hope, its own heartbeat. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. May your own story be written in courage and sealed with love.